So excited to join y'all again today from the remote space, all fun, and talk about identity, intention, and impact, and why this is important to consider as we work on our design efforts. So the readings for this lecture are going to again be attached as always in the blog, but it'll get you starting to think and question some of the narratives that you heard around design, thinking about inclusion and equity in new ways, and start to kind of think about how we can unlearn our own biases and the importance of that to establishing the change that we want to see in the world. So I look forward to hearing how these readings work for y'all. And to kind of do a brief review, and I'm mostly going to not go over the full framework because I know the full framework has a lot of questions, but I'm going to highlight, again, this is what we talked about last time. It's really a framework to help you to understand and build a system for thinking about the change that you want and ensuring that you're being held accountable to the things that people are needing that are dealing with certain problems and have been historically underinvested. And I want to highlight specifically working with others to give agency. And I think this is a thing that design has sought to do in the social good space, but has accomplished with limited success, really because of these issues of existing power dynamics that we'll cover in the next lecture as we think about ourselves and the community. But then specifically we'll cover today, not actually acknowledging and challenging our own biases in our language and how they impact communities that are underinvested. So that's kind of the topic of today, which will hopefully help you as you're crafting your theories of change and further, building on them, to be ready to be critical in the thinking that you have. So intention versus impact. I know that a lot of you start doing this work with the best of intentions. You are here because you want to do good in the world. But sometimes we don't realize that we can be, for all intents and purposes, wanting to do the best, but have very negative impacts, which is something that in the reading from Creative Reaction Lab is highlighted really well, that design is the intention and actually the unintentional impact behind an outcome. If we think about the world as designed in a certain way, that there were intentions behind that design, and it has impacts on people that are historically underinvested. And to really do impactful change, we have to think about impact. We have to think about what our decisions are doing and how they're affecting other people. And so as we think about, moving into this course, we should always be thinking about that impact is a greater focus than intention. Every action that we take has consequences, and many of which that we've taken against those that have been underinvested or marginalized has only further marginalized them and was, maybe it was a good idea, but things like Play Pump have just further marginalized and underinvested communities. To focus on good intent and to conversate around that is actually privileged. To be able to say, I had the best of intent, I just wanted to do good, and not realizing that you were not being critical around your theory of change. And as a result, led to those negative outcomes that actually hurt communities. And I think intentions are also sometimes tied into saviorism. So thinking that you have the best solution, you can be the best individual for the job, will sometimes lead you to prescribing things that might not actually be needed. And so this should be avoided, especially, if we do fail, realizing that, this is something we have to learn and own up to, rather than be like, I had the best of intentions and I didn't mean to fail. You still led to some negative consequences, and growing and being invited into those conversations is critical to the work. So I just want to point out that systemic injustices in our world are often upheld by the best of intentions. And we think about the pyramid of systemic injustice, the policies are being held in place by our cultural relationships with others, as well as our own individual mindsets. And so the more that we challenge these intentions and think about the impact, we can start to see changes at those levels. So where does design go wrong? And where can we see that even some great intentions of design have negative impacts on communities? And so I'll highlight a few examples of challenging design's good intents. Designed for the user as this important person, But who is the user in many of these circumstances? The user is not specific enough. And often when people think about the norm, they'll think about whiteness. They'll think about maleness. They'll think about straightness, able-bodiedness. The norm is the hegemony or the ideal that people are seeking towards. And so users will often reflect what people consider is the standard or the ideal. Universality and humanness is, we want a process that's human-centered. We want to focus on people and their problems. But sometimes by focusing on humanity as a big concept, we forget to realize that there are many differences in our lives, from our cultures to the way we look, to the way the society treats us. And by erasing those margins and ignoring them in the pursuit of universality, we realize that we're actually harming communities more than we're able to help them. Moving forward, the aesthetics of design and the cleanness of design will often lead to sometimes policing of ideas that aren't palatable. If you can't make an app out of it or can't make a clean poster, sometimes people are like, is that really the design that we want? And not realizing that policing will actually lead to marginalization and further underinvesting. Another concept, Silicon Valley loves this one, moving fast and breaking things, which, sounds great. We're continuously trying new things and iterating, but sometimes that can have really negative consequences. We see that if we fail a community, that every time someone comes in, it's moving fast and breaking things, then all you have are broken things and you're not actually moving forward in a meaningful way. And finally, empathy. The formation of human-centered design is empathy, and I believe a lot in empathy. But I feel like sometimes empathy can lead to projecting problems on others from one interview. So you interview a person who's not of your background, and you say you empathize with them, but you might be projecting expected experiences that don't live up to the lived expertise of that individual. And I think that the design is a reframe for white supremacy. There's a good quote in there that there is a self-righteousness and privilege to being a design thinker. And that puts the designer in a position of power over the people they're designing for. And the ways that we use design and the language can be gatekeepers to those that want to do justice work, but feel like they don't live up to the jargon or the norms of design thinking. So how do we start to challenge this language? And we actually start to think that a lot of the common design language is derived from corporate America and derived from profit making. I mean, solution, it's an idea for meeting a difference in the market. How do we make a solution that we can profit off of? And instead of thinking about, maybe people are solving their own problems, they just need a way to solve them better. Or there's a way that we can improve the way that they're already solving their own problems. Users often eliminates, this idea of people and their individualities by focusing on a user as a kind of corporate end to your project. And that also kind of lies into target audience. You're not thinking about the people that you're working with, you're thinking about them as someone you're designing for rather than designing with or learning from as lived experts of their own experiences. And finally, this lends itself into, we're thinking about those below us as designers. We think about them as minorities or poor or lower income or vulnerable, and they're the beneficiaries of our design rather than individuals that can really teach us a lot around how they live. And we can learn a lot that's not just a part of, a kind of colonial mindset that these people need our help and our saving. And so shifting language can actually shift power and actually allows us to make better choices that lead to better impacts. Thinking about approaches and interventions instead of solutions. Problems are so complex that a solution would probably be just destroying the entire system. But approach and intervention allows it to be more realistic and more in the moment for the people that are actually you want to help. Thinking about people and audience as a focus, community as a focus, you're putting it on people and their individualities and the things that they're dealing with more than thinking them about a target audience or a corporate thing that you're trying to target. And thinking about people as stakeholders in their own choices. Like they have been designing things their entire lives. And you coming in as an external entity, even with the best of intentions, might still have negative impact because you're not thinking about them as people that you can work with and learn from. And that finally gets to the last point. Historically underinvested is a good point to say that this is a pattern, this is a system, versus thinking about them as these targeted groups of minority. Underinvested helps us to realize that minority in what sense? In the white sense, yes. And the result of their minoritization has been that they've been underinvested in this country. So I hope this language, again, helps you to start to frame how to have better impact if you are able to set yourself up with language that actually empowers people rather than treats it as a power dynamic. And this is good to then, as we move forward, to understand your positionality as we work on our design challenges. Who we are impacts our lens on solving problems. I will say I'm a white, middle-class LGBTQ person, and I see the world differently than someone who is Black, straight, and male. There is very different ways that we're thinking about problems. And that is something that we have to understand, especially if we're working with people that aren't like us. And so we have to check in ourselves and our privileges, the things that make us different and the things that give us power in certain situations, and how we might wield those for both positive and negative impact. And all of these things, there's lots of privilege activities out there that can help you to assess these things. But at least you can start to say, as, again, a white person, I carry a lot of privilege. What do I need to understand if I'm going into a community that's not white that I might ignore because all my privileges of my life have taught me certain things and certain learnings of my life? And that's very different from if I was working in LGBTQ space. I know what it's like to be LGBTQ, and I know what it's like to not have those support structures, to not have supportive family. And that might not be understood by someone who's always been straight, heterosexual, who doesn't have to live with that. And so these are important to position ourselves in who we are so that when we're working with others, we understand a little bit more about that our differences, help us to frame how we're seeing the world. Because many of these differences lead to the various isms of the world. If these are not checked in on and we're not acknowledging these differences, we find ourselves creating hierarchies of all different kinds. And those hierarchies have always lent themselves in design. Class and whiteness have lent, and sexism have even lent themselves into design in terms of who's in the room and who's making the decisions. And so this is something that we have to reckon with if we're going to be designing in a systemic way. And this, Leslie Ann Noel frames it perfectly, challenging the idea that design is just for one group, and that people that don't look like the norm of design, and what even the norm is wholly up for debate, can still be designers. They are making choices, and they are thinking about the world and how it's set up. And it's very important that we decenter those that have the most privilege from establishing the protocols and the practices of how we do our design. Because the more we decenter whiteness, maleness, straightness, we're going to realize that there are ways and practices of looking at the world that aren't just what is being upheld by a lot of our structures. It can actually maybe help us work towards an even more inclusive world. So here's some tactics that are from some readings and also from, my own lived experience and readings that I've gathered that can really help you to establish your inclusive positionality, understand where you are in the world, what biases you might carry, and how to overcome them so that you can work towards justice. It's really important, for one, actively listening and leaning into your discomfort. So often we are afraid to talk about these systems and talk about hard issues like race because we are just uncomfortable. We don't like it. We hate it, and it makes us feel bad. But part of this is a learning process to be better, because without listening from lived experts that are from these backgrounds, we are never going to get better. We're never going to move forward. And that will take some time, but it is part of our processes. We have to remove hierarchy and establish lived experience. We should not expect those that are white and male in the room to establish their dominance and say that this is the protocol and this is the process. Because everyone in their own lives are an expert of their experience. They're an expert of being a Black woman. They're an expert of being a queer Latinx woman. They're an expert of being a trans man, that many of us, if we're not part of that background, we're not going to understand it. And so this is just critical for thinking about your positions in a group. And that lends itself into embracing transparency and honesty and making a space where it's safe to do so and you will not be judged for being like, here is what I have felt about being in this position. Here's what I felt when people say sign or promise me a social intervention. And that honesty, again, if we lean into it, we can do a lot of good. And do not assume understanding in any way. It's okay to say, I don't know. So many of us are afraid to, but it's okay to say, I don't know. I'm going to learn from you, and I'm going to be honest that I want to learn from you. Some more fun tactics. Both and thinking. So this is the concept that both things can exist at the same time. That is very important for understanding oppression. There are varying forms of oppression, but oppression can exist at the same time. You can be a white poor person and experience that marginalization and underinvestment, and you can also have racist tendencies and believe that oh my gosh, my brain slipped for a second. But basically those things can exist at the same time. Like, even if you are not as privileged as other white individuals, you could still acknowledge that you still hold more privilege than someone who is Black and poor. And so there's a world that we can establish these complexities and believe that there are things that can exist at the same time. Defining the identity that matters most to them. Don't choose, if someone is Black, don't choose that Blackness is the way that they see themselves, or if there's LGBTQ, don't establish that LGBTQ is the way that they see themselves. That is up to each person and up to the way that they share their lived expertise. And that's how you should interact with them as designers versus the tokenization that often comes with picking identities based on what you think you need in your collection. Shift to opposite-based thinking versus deficit-based thinking. This was kind of covered in Leslie's article, but she talked about the focus on joy over, sadness and oppression and marginalization. Think about what communities have done well over years of dealing with underinvestment. And that can be really powerful for shifting our thinking and shifting power and realizing that there is a lot of knowledge that we don't have when we are not a part of those communities. And finally, oppression takes on many forms. Oppression is not a singular thing. It is a system of marginalizations. And as more we understand that it is not just what we expect from our own experiences, the more we can start to challenge all the ways in which the system plays out and affects those around us. So to close, a lot of topics in this session. I expect that the lecture, please read the lecture again, because there's some things to reflect on. And I also would love your feedback on this one, especially. But to close, to work towards liberation or the freedom from these oppressive structures, we must know ourselves and our biases. We will not move forward if we do not challenge the ways that we work now. Because as we learned in our systems thinking, we as relational beings and individuals are upholding the structures that be. And the more that we challenge that, we can make the transformational change that we want, that brings us towards that collective future. So your next readings are going to be about understanding the self and the community, and give a little more deep dive into what even community is and why it's important to thinking about, better design processes for systemic injustices. So I hope you enjoy them. As always, again, email me if anything didn't make sense in this lecture or you need more clarification. I'm happy to consult in any way, and I'm thankful for you for hopping on today and looking forward to seeing you again on Friday.